Just say a quick word about the background to our second topic and General Electric and rugby and what is proposed, and then we'll go into the questioning. Steve.
So currently the rugby facility of GE Power Conversion is under threat of closure for and cease manufacture of equipment and transfer that work to Nancy. That was announced to the members of the European Works Council in November 2017, and we then engaged in a process of consultation which continues now until the end of next month. And obviously we started a campaign, myself and my fellow employees, to try and bring this to the awareness of Parliament and to various, the Chief of the Defence Staff, the First Sea Lord, and because of our concern for the future of apprentices, we wrote to His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales, knowing what his concerns are for skills in young people.
Thank you, Ruth.
Thank you. I represent Kidsgrove, which is the former GE site, and our jobs were transferred to rugby and have now on the verge of disappearing. Were you consulted at all before the announcement in 2017 to the European Works Council?
There was no consultation at all prior to that. We were attending a meeting in Berlin, a regular meeting of the European Works Council, and then told that we had to leave early from our hotel location to move to another location where the CEO was there with one of the American bosses, to be told that they were now looking, they had a proposal to cease manufacture in rugby and at the Berlin facility as well. And further to what you said about Kidsgrove, it was interesting because I know you were involved in the campaign to save Kidsgrove, and I believe at the time they said to you that it was, whilst it was regrettable sort of that Kidsgrove had to close, that this would help secure the long-term future of rugby. And in less than a year's time, they now want to cease manufacture and close the factory in rugby.
Yeah, that was not a word they should have used with me at all at the time. I'm interested just because this is, at the conversation I was having with them at that point, they had a testing facility at Kidsgrove that was being moved to rugby. Where is that going now, or are GE, given GE are struggling so much, are they losing that capability full stop?
No, that testing facility, that will cease. That will also move to Nancy.
Will they be able to do it in the same way?
No, that's the equipment to move from Kidsgrove was more of the civilian type work rather than the defence work. Yes,
defence as well, yeah.
A small part. So they should be able to do it, but it would cause rather a lot of disruption. And I would ask the committee to be aware of when management present their case, they have lots of talk of pitchers and catchers and gatekeepers and how this will all go seamlessly, but that hasn't turned out to be the case in reality so far.
Steve, what was the response to your letter last year to Larry Culp?
Pretty flippant and quite dismissive, to be honest. We have supplied you with a pack of materials, and those letters and the response are in the bundle as well. In tab C, I think, you'll find letters from myself to government ministers, in fact, Secretary of State, a number of letters there that I've written to the Secretary of State in relation to rugby, but also in respect of your direct question to Larry Culp as the CEO. And you'll find that on page 4 in tab C. You'll find my letter, you'll find the GE's response, which was effectively to say that we're in a consultation phase and therefore we'll be consulting with the unions locally, and there'll be full engagement with the unions locally, and we won't be making any final decisions until those consultations have concluded. Of course, it's very apparent to us that those decisions have already been taken in reality at a board level in the United States, and we're now in a situation of having to reverse a decision and put forward the political and economic case for retaining that work, not just in the UK, but at rugby. And it's vitally important that we do that. The flippant response led to a second letter to Larry Culp from Len McCluskey as General Secretary of the Union, where he said that he was very disappointed that he hadn't actually responded directly to the points that I'd raised, all of the concerns that no doubt during the course of this hearing will become apparent. And the response back to Len McCluskey as the General Secretary of the Union was in the same vein, directly this time though from Larry Culp, and again stating that this is in a consultation phase, and therefore until the consultation has been exhausted, we won't be making any final decisions.
Have you been kept informed of any conversations between the MOD and GE on this?
No, I've written to Gavin Williamson as Secretary of State on a number of occasions. I had a response back from Gutu Beb, who then, of course, decided to leave post, and we never managed to meet on this question. I've met Stuart Andrew on this question subsequently, and on other matters, including relating to the FSS that we previously took evidence on, of course, where we had a very constructive meeting with Stuart, but very little positive came out of it, of course, although it was a positive discussion. And in those letters, they're very clear that this is actually a business decision. And we believe that this goes to the heart of the question of government's engagement in this. Because the government was so concerned at the time of the takeover of Convertine by GE that the deed poll was agreed between government and GE. And you yourself, as chair of the committee, have written indeed to Stuart Andrew expressing, and we completely concur with the comments that were made in your own correspondence to Stuart Andrew about the use of the depot to protect national security interests here in the UK and indeed the rugby site. And in the letter back to myself from Gutu Bebe didn't mention that this was a business decision and therefore the government would be leaving this to business, but very interestingly, in a very similarly worded response to Steve Kerr from the ministry, from a civil servant in the ministry, he did go on to say, you will understand, however, that the future of the facility is ultimately a decision for the company. And that's on page 11 in your bundle of materials. Now, we don't accept that. We fundamentally do not accept that. Either the deed poll was put in place for a particular reason, to defend the interests, the national security interests of UK PLC and our naval fleets in particular, and the power conversion equipment that's produced in rugby, and therefore is a meaningful deed poll and is an enforceable deed poll via government, or it's not, in which case that raises very serious questions for government about the nature of the agreement itself and the terms of the agreement, the enforceability of the agreement, or indeed it is enforceable and the government are choosing not to enforce provisions of the deed poll agreement. And we believe, as you do, this committee does, in the correspondence that we've seen between yourself and Stuart Andrew as the MP responsible, that they have an absolute, not just an absolute responsibility to defend the interests of the workforce and the product secured at rugby, but indeed have the legal basis to do so under the deed poll. So therefore it's our conclusion that government are choosing, again, as was the case with FSS, are making political choices about what actions they take to protect UK PLC national security interests.
Okay, thank you. And at this point, I'd like to acknowledge and welcome Mark Pawsey, the rugby MP, who's joined us for this part of the session. And so in relation to the condition that was undertaken originally when the previous move took place, has there been any comment on that aspect at all coming back to you from the management of GE?
Other than the deed poll, no, there's been no more further comeback on that. I mean, it seems straightforward enough that these undertakings were given by GE, and it's quite clear that because of the sovereign capability and the strategic importance of it, that, you know, the government wouldn't insist on having these things in place when GE acquired us. So, you know, I can't, as a layperson, understand why the government isn't now upholding what it put in place in at the first point. And Mr. Pawsey has been involved, and I believe his has been much along the same lines as, you know, it's a commercial decision. We regret this, but it has to be down to the company.
Just to be clear, that's the response that Mr. Pawsey got, as opposed to his position. Is that what you're saying?
Oh, Mr. Pawsey's been supportive of the position, sort of thing. It's the response he's got back when he's approached government ministers.
Could you spell out for us, Steve, the consequences if the move goes ahead? How many jobs are at risk? What knowledge is at risk? What
So originally we were looking at 197 direct jobs would go with the ceasing of manufacture. That figure has now dropped to 185 because a number of employees have decided to leave the company because of the uncertainty. Also, there has been an additional 60 people who've already left the company. We're split over two sites, basically the engineering and commercial aspects and the manufacturing side. In order to protect the manufacturing site for as long as possible, we engaged in a redundancy process under phase 1, and that resulted in 60 jobs to go, which left from the Boughton Road site. And that was to, as I say, to buy time for work to come in. But we were also waiting on positive news from the Bays Committee and from central government on the Swansea Bay project. Rugby has the world's largest vacuum pressure impregnation tank. And that is key, or it would have been key for the Swansea Bay contract. And it remains key for the production of the Type 26 motors. I believe the next largest machine is in China, but hopefully we won't see work being moved to China for the Royal Navy. And those figures are only the direct figures. We obviously employ quite a number of small sort of specialist workshops in the immediate area, so you're going to have a knock-on effect on there now in the supply and logistics chain. How you would quantify that to say, I'm just a layperson in this, it would be hard, but clearly there is going to be a knock-on effect in the wider community as well, over and above these jobs.
Steve Turner, you mentioned earlier some of the relationships you've had in secondments and job opportunities for people to go from one site, in that case shipyards, to another. Have there been discussions with management about future opportunities, relocations, placements for staff currently involved with rugby?
Well, we'll always enter into those discussions. It's actually quite a pioneering agreement. It's the first of its kind that we've reached in relation to Camel Air and BAE Systems as the prime contractor into customer for Camel Air on the nuclear work. So that's not been exported elsewhere, but it is something that we very much like to do, and we will look to do wherever that's possible, and we'll certainly do that. In the case of rugby, our primary point of rugby, of course, is there is no need. In fact, it's a gross betrayal of our national security interests to allow the rugby site to close and for that work to transfer to France. A lot of that work is incredibly sensitive work, as you'll be very well aware as a Defence Committee, and it's not stuff that we'd necessarily want to even touch on in this forum. But of course it is incredibly sensitive and highly secure work. A lot of that work can only be done in the UK. The carrier motors, the power conversion equipment were produced at Rugby, of course, using the VPI tank. There is no other VPI facility. You can't just pick that tank up and transfer it to Nancy or anywhere else. That tank is an integral part of the fabric of the building. And to lose that facility would be a really detrimental measure taken against the interests of our Royal Naval fleets. There is not a serving or in-service vessel in the naval fleet that hasn't had its power conversion and engine capabilities produced at the Rugby site. The Rugby site's 130 years old. It produced its first stuff for the services in 1914, in the First World War. So it has a huge amount of experience and knowledge. So when Steve talks about the jobs, the 185 jobs that are at risk, this is a combined hundreds and hundreds of years of knowledge and experience that we lose when we lose employees, which is irreplaceable. And it's very similar arguments, of course, to the argument that we had on the FSS around the loss of jobs, the loss of skill, the loss of experience. It's not just a 5-year apprenticeship that a youngster leaving school will enter into and be able to replace those employees. These are people with 40 years personal experience and knowledge of working on programmes that are incredibly sensitive to the national interests. And to lose that work, and for that work to even be threatened to be taken from the UK shores and transferred to France, is a dereliction of duty, we would say, on the part of the government.
I mean, this was the knowledge base was brought up as one of the points that we made with senior central management, and I should make it clear that it's central management that we have our concerns with. The local UK management have worked their way up through the ranks as apprentices to become managing directors, so they know the business inside out. In the last 8 years, we've had 3 CEOs, because the GE philosophy is that after 3 years, if you haven't moved on, you're a failure. And in one of the European Works Councils, we noted that on the employee side of the table, there was 400 years of experience, whilst on the management side, there was less than 50 years of experience in the industry. And we try to point out that we've always been in a collaborative and working together phase. You know, we need, perhaps more than central management, who flit from one senior position to another continent all the time. We need our companies to be successful, and we want to contribute that, and that's where our 400 years of plus of experience comes from. We're there to assist them in their decision making. But unfortunately, there seems to be the American attitude that trade unions in particular and employee forums are hostile. They seem to think it's a confrontational relationship, which it never has been prior to the acquisition by General Electric.
Can I just ask you this question? If the government were to decide to enforce the guarantee that it sought before the original takeover was allowed, what would that actually entail? If it says, right, we're enforcing this guarantee, does that mean that GE simply could not close this enterprise?
Effectively, yes. I mean, we have looked at other facilities. The rugby plant is unique in many ways. As part of the alternatives to closing the site and to reduce costs, we looked at smaller buildings, a smaller footprint, but of course that becomes impractical because of the VPI tank, which is a huge piece of equipment. We have one of the largest heavy lift cranes in the UK. It has a 250-ton capability. The height of the building is they're not built to that height anymore. And I believe the pylons, once you close rugby, you will never be able to reopen it. The pylons alone in that building today would cost £1 million for each pylon to be driven into the ground.
Said that already a fair number of jobs have gone. Do you think that there's a process underway here to try and make closure, what should we say, inevitable, irrespective of the government's right to enforce a guarantee which should make closure out of the question?
This is a concern that we've had, and as a trade union we've been looking at the skills matrix of the employees to retain the most talented ones. Those employees, the 60 that have already went from the Boughton Road facility, were largely people who were coming towards the end of their careers and were looking for effectively a form of early retirement. But there were people who also applied that were turned down because of the critical skills that they have. They were not allowed to retire. But that is always a fear that it becomes a foregone conclusion that unfortunately we would love to have kept the site open, but unfortunately there's too many people have now been lost.
Yes, you mentioned about national security and the deed poll. How much of the work on the site is classified?
That's not a topic I'd like to speak about too openly in a public forum. If substantial, I mean, I would point out that the rugby site is on the government's List X, and that obviously you will know that those are buildings, defence manufacturing capabilities that are of national strategic importance. Overall, the Type 26 work we do is officially rated as sensitive, and there are elements of the Type 26 work which are classified as NNPPI UKIs only. Now, I'm not sure what the abbreviation stands for, but I'm sure you gentlemen will. But to give an idea of how sensitive it is, we've had foreign nationals who have been the site leader for manufacturing, and they were not allowed to go onto the shop floor until they gave notice so that the equipment could be covered up by tarpaulins, and they were also excluded from technical meetings where sort of confidential secret and top secret information was shared. So it's very sensitive, and all the employees have to be security cleared to work on site.
So if you
Eyes only, that would of its essence be compromised if that work was moved to France.
This is why we can't understand GE's philosophy. They said, it's only the total package which is UK eyes only. If we cut it up into small work packages, then it's not top secret. But they're going to put the whole lot of the equipment together and it becomes the top secret piece of equipment.
What's your understanding then of the classification, security classification of the Nancy site?
Nancy has no UK security classification whatsoever. There was a visit recently by both the Ministry of Defence and British Aerospace, who are the lead partner in the Type 26 programme. And they went round and they were actually surprised to see Russian contracts on the shop floor. And they asked the question of, does this mean that Russian nationals? And they said, oh yes, we regularly have Russian engineers who come on the shop floor. There is also the concern that in 2011, two Chinese nationals who were employees of the company were detained and subsequently deported from France for having civil nuclear sensitive material on their computers. And that involved a raid by the French intelligence services into the matter. So it's a very serious matter. And, you know, this is a constant threat. We saw late last year at another General Electric facility in Belgium some more Chinese nationals who had obtained information on the latest generation of fighter aircraft engines. And I believe at least one gentleman's been deported to America or extradited to America to stand trial. So there is also the threat to the infrastructure. The naval facility in Rugby has its completely separate standalone sort of computer IT network, which has to be approved by the Ministry of Defence to make it cyber secure. There is nothing of that ilk in France, and one of the IT personnel work told me you're looking at least 18 to potentially 2.5 years to procure and install and test sort of a secure IT infrastructure.
Clearly, I mean, all of that would be of great concern to the Navy, and one wonders whether most of the exchange of correspondence and so on has actually been with the procurement section rather than with the operational side of Navy. And I think, Chairman, that's something that we may wish to inquire. But also, I presume that there would be some concerns of both the Australian and Canadian navies because of their involvement with the Type 26 programme. How would it potentially impact on them?
Well, those ships were sold to the Australian and Canadian governments on the basis that they would be built in the United Kingdom at the Rugby facility. And obviously...
Is that implicit or explicit as far as you're aware?
I'm not aware of those... I can ask the question for you, or perhaps it's maybe a better question to ask sort of management at the next meeting.
I've just add it's not just the Type 26, of course, which for the first time we've got a fantastic export order with Canada and indeed Australia. We're also the procurement source for the Type 31E, which is explicitly being designed for export. And of course the FSS that we've spoken about earlier, and all those in-service frigates and destroyers.
The proceeding will start shortly. 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 The proceeding will start shortly.
Signatures, sonar signature becomes known, or the vibration analysis of the ships themselves, then these ships become worthless. There's so much target practice for sort of hostile fleets, because you can program the equipment to seek out that signature, and your anti-submarine sort of vessel then becomes a victim. There's also the concern, we've mentioned Australia and Canada. We've also provided a number of ships for the US Navy. We've done the take ships, which are the equivalent of the fleet support sort of big ammunition carriers. We've done that. And we also provided the US Navy with the motors for the stealth destroyers that they have, the Zumwalt class. Now, we've had anecdotal evidence, but nothing in writing, unfortunately. Those 3 Zumwalt ships are now shortly due for refurbishment. And there are real concerns that the US Navy will have reluctance in sort of putting that work to France. There's always been an edginess, shall I say, sort of reluctance by the US Navy to involve the French in any of their military work.
Moving away just from the security side, is there a danger of losing UK intellectual property as a result of this?
One of the key things is the intellectual property rights are with the GE. However, that work was funded largely by UK taxpayer. Now, I believe the contract allows that if it's at risk, that the MOD has the right to retain that and give it to another contractor, so they could give that information direct to British Aerospace. But one of the key things is the 20, 30 years more of experience that the workforce brings to it. It's not necessarily an intellectual patent or something that we have, but you have the skills they have in reducing the vibration and the shock hardening of it, and of the electrical insulation, which is unique to power conversion in rugby in the world. That it's taken some of the guys sort of the best part of 20 years before they're allowed to work on this equipment, because of the insulation requirements are so tight.
Right.
Before I ask Mark to ask the last couple of questions, I'm just looking at the very handy dossier that you kindly brought with you today, some of the material we've seen before, and just looking back at the deed poll to which General Electric is a party, signed on the 13th of June 2011, I noticed that it says security undertakings, and paragraphs 2.4 and 2.5 say that they shall procure continuity of development and or supply, including support, of all goods and services for military programs in accordance with the relevant contractual obligations for which the Ministry of Defence is a customer. And the other one, they shall procure that the originals of all information and material generated by Converteam UK pertaining to military programs shall remain in the UK, and then it goes on in that vein. So have you had, any of you, had any indication of what exactly is proposed, given that they're planning to delete this facility? How is anybody proposing to keep these very important functions and services to continue to be supplied to the Defence Forces of the United Kingdom? Have you had either from government or from GE any indication of how these services will be supplied in the future, if at all?
No, nothing at all. The only reply that we have had is the letter from the civil servant at the Defence Ministry and Supply, which, as Steve has said, was a dereliction of duty. We said, well, ultimately it's up to GE what they do with the facility. Now, when this was first announced, I said to the CEO, Mr. Aziz Mohammed, that this would never be allowed, because we were aware of the deed poll agreement, because this was so key to the UK national defence. His view, well, GE gets what it wants, this is just a transfer to another country. They seem to have the understanding or lack of understanding of sovereign nations. They think moving work from the UK to France is rather like moving it from one US state to another. And at a subsequent meeting with another American gentleman from GE, I asked him the question, if a project was marked top secret, as some of the elements is, would the US Navy or the US government allow the work to be transferred to Canada? Which, well, certainly not. So why then do you think you can, oh, well, I'm not involved directly in that project, so I can't comment on that, was the reply. But there does seem to be a lack of understanding, and it goes back to what I said previously. We've had 3 chief executive officers in 8 years, and they've come from various backgrounds. In fact, I believe all 3 of them have come from financial backgrounds rather than engineering backgrounds.
Let's refer to that letter you said, because you wrote you fired off a salvo of letters to key people, including the CDS and the First Sea Lord and so forth, and you had this reply from Michael Gwyther, Assistant Head DE&S Policy Secretariat Ships. And he says at one point, he says, the concerns, this was dated, let's have a look, 14th of November 18, the concerns that you raise about the loss of sovereign capability and security are matters the MOD takes very seriously, and I can assure you they are being carefully considered. But in the next but one sentence, they say, you will understand, however, that the future of the facility is ultimately a decision for the company. And towards the end, he says, no matter what the company's final decision on the rugby facility, the MOD will continue to work closely with GE to ensure that key programs can continue to be supplied and supported with the equipment they need to support the Royal Navy. Is there any way that GE could continue in the UK to supply those secret and top secret elements of their services that they're supplying at Rugby at the moment? Is there any other facility they could use to supply?
If the Rugby facility closes, no, there is no alternative place in the UK that is visible. Say we have the largest VPI tank in the world, which is key to it. The height of the building is another prerequisite.
So what could this MOD, I'm sorry to ask you to put yourself into the mind of somebody else, but what could they be imagining when they say, on the one hand, we share your concerns, however, it's up to the company. However, they're still going to supply everything that we need. Now, how can that be possible if they're going to close the only facility that we've got in the country?
I don't believe it is possible. And when we received that letter, it beggared belief. I shared it with my colleagues. We expected something more than that. When you said we were expecting, the deed poll to stand, it's quite clear that the deed poll requires it to be done in the UK. It was interesting. I had a meeting. We had a Trafalgar Night meeting. The company at its Whetstone facility every year invites senior naval officers along. And we had a reply from the First Sea Lord, which was, thank you for your letter. I'm now passing it on to the relevant department for review. And I had an opportunity to speak to Rear Admiral Methven, who was involved initially with the Type 26 programme. Apparently the letter had gone sort of far and wide within the senior ranks of the Navy, because they were greatly concerned of it. Obviously, as serving officers, they can't officially come out and be seen to contradict government policy, but they had serious concerns of this proposal and couldn't understand why it was being proposed in the first place.
Mark.
Jen, where actually are we now in the process? I mean, what stage have we reached, and what are the subsequent likely timings?
So at this moment in time, consultation will close at the 31st of May. And the company have told us that there will be no compulsory redundancies before that date, when consultation ends. We were hoping to hear back from the Ministry perhaps on an earlier release of the batch 2 of the Type 26, which would enable the site to stay open, admittedly on a smaller number of people, but we've taken the view that it's better to have a smaller number of people involved and we can rebuild. We've been cut in the past, but once this facility closes, it's gone forever. But the line still is that the company will cease manufacture of the Type 26, and there's other equipment, civilian work that's done, sort of generators and all that work will move to the Nonsay facility.
At what time would the work transfer?
This, you would see there would be it's not going to close the very next day. You're looking at an 18-month time period to wind down the operation and to transfer work and tooling that would need to leave the rugby facility to move it to Nonsay.
If a decision in principle was confirmed on or around the 31st of May, the drawdown would effectively take about 18 months. Effectively, yes. All right. I'm just thinking about how much time is left, in a sense, if you see what I mean. Now, Type 45, one of the most capable ships in the world. The Americans admire the capability, but it's not a secret she had propulsion problems. How involved is rugby in the retrofit programme to put right the propulsion issues in the Type 45?
Rugby has permanent teams at Rosyth and at Plymouth involved in the refurbishment and retrofitting of the Type 45s. So one of the concerns is that not only will we lose the ability to manufacture new equipment for the Royal Navy, we will also lose the ability to service our fleet going forward as well.
So presumably that programme would transfer to Nonsay?
That work would transfer to Nonsay as well.
Okay, because his worry would be that those ships are absolutely critical to the defence of the carriers and the fleet more broadly. And at the moment, they're the only very limited anti-ballistic missile capability we've got anywhere in the UK Armed Forces, and their ability to move is therefore very, very important. This move to Nonsay, is it likely to be a problem in terms of re-engineering the 45s?
I missed that.
If we move to Nonsay, is that likely to disrupt the re-engineering of the Type 45 destroyers?
Yes, I mean, it's the experience of you've got to transfer the experience of the guys. That's not going to help. The workforce in France are not used to doing naval projects, so it will delay that substantially. They won't know the workarounds that have been developed and key other aspects of the jobs.
So just tell us briefly something about the Nonsay facility, its size, how many people it employs, and kind of what its core business has been to date.
The Nonsay facility is a general shipbuilding site. It's interesting, I was having a talk before we came here. Originally that was built by the French state and sold to the French engineering group Alstom for €1. And at the time we wrote to one of the European commissioners, who's now Lord Mandelson, to complain that this was illegal state aid, surely. And the answer that we got back was, no, this is a key national strategic infrastructure and this is allowed. And we rolled our eyes, but we had done what we'd done. Now, the Nonsay facility, one of the American managers will tell you that the rugby facility has a leaky roof. It's an old building, whereas Nonsay is a state-of-the-art building. I think it's maybe 15 years old. 20 years at the most, whereas the rugby one is considerably older. However, the equipment is of the same generation as what you will find in rugby. They didn't have brand new equipment. They have a smaller VPI tank there, but they use a completely different insulation system. They have a different resin.
VPI tank?
Vacuum pressure impregnation. So when they build the motor, they have to take it and dip it into a huge varnish tank effectively to protect it from short circuits. Now the system in Nonsay is smaller. They use a different resin to what the Royal Navy is used to. So effectively you could have two types of equipment in service at the same time on a different design. And going back briefly to the Type 26, Because of the different technology that the French are looking to employ, it could mean a larger motor, and the whole design of the ship may have to change to accommodate the larger size because of the poorer insulation qualities of the French process.
Right, and have they done any naval military work to date at Nancy, or has it all been civilian? No.
None that I'm aware of. This was one of the reasons that the Ministry of Defence and British Aerospace went to look at the facility. They have done shipping work before for civilian ships. They've not done work for the French Navy or any military. It's all been civilian work.
So point one, they've done no military work physically, and point two, they're not used to all the kind of security and other classifications that go with working in a military environment. So culturally they're different, and in engineering terms they're different.
Yes.
Yeah? Is that a fair?
That's correct.
All right, okay. And how many people work at Nancy?
At the moment, I think there's about 800 employees at the Nancy site.
How many at Rugby currently, just to give us an idea?
At the moment, we're looking at 635, I believe. It's 633 in the...
Nancy's a bit bigger, but not much. Okay. And have you had any conversations with your French counterparts?
Yes.
Unions
we speak on the telephone and we meet regularly. My counterpart is Gregory Pasteur of the CGT trade union. And he said he's willing to come over to London and speak to the committee if they so require it. GE will say that this is a matter of a downturn in the marketplace that's led to this closure. The French workers are of the belief, as is the UK workforce, that this has largely been a failure of investment in sort of R&D and the organisation of GE centrally. It's a highly complex and burdensome organisation that seems to put delay after delay into the processes. Now, the French have said that they are concerned that if the Type 26 work, let alone the other work that would be transferred to them, that this then will give General Electric the excuse to close the Nancy facility. As you may be aware, so obviously it's incredibly difficult to make French employees redundant. And it was only last month that an undertaking that General Electric gave to the French state that they would create 1,000 new jobs, which they've failed to do, and they've had to pay a hefty fine for that basis. But the French colleagues are concerned that GE will put that work to them, which they have no experience of. That then gives General Electric the excuse, well, we tried to fill your factory with this work. Unfortunately, you failed, so now we'll have to move it to either to Eastern Europe or the United States.
Okay. I think you've managed to convince the committee of the seriousness of the situation. What's your next move?
Well, the next move...
Run under the sun. You've been, whacking the postage bill up on behalf of your members. Fair enough. Yeah. But what's your next move in trying to keep this place open?
We've put forward a proposal that that if the Type 26 work is batch 2 is brought forward early, that in itself would not secure the complete site staying open, but it would secure for the medium term the core workforce. That would mean that the current sort of closure sign, which is up across the building, would go away, and we could start getting work in again from the commercial side as well. Because at the moment we've potentially lost customers who, because we don't manufacture equipment that takes 3-4 weeks to make, you're talking of sort of many months for the equipment. And if you see a closure sign, a potential closure sign, you're not going to...
Have GE indicated that if this work were brought forward, they would lift this threat of immediate closure? So we still don't know whether that would happen.
No. I believe there's been talks between the Ministry of Defence and Mr. Mohammed, the CEO. But as to what, I've not been privy to those conversations.
That potentially is your lifeline. If you're going to stay alive, you need that brought forward.
We
if
need
it isn't brought forward,
yeah.
practically that's the end game.
That's the end, the factory will close. Say if batch 2 is brought forward, that gives us a lifeline, and that we can then rebuild again. And then there's, as I say, there's it will also give us work until the American government is looking at a huge fleet. They're looking at, for their future frigate program, there's, I believe, 56 ships they're looking to build. And because of the tight timescales involved, it's only the Type 26 motor that can fulfil that need. So, of course, when that comes in, that would guarantee the success of the rugby facility longer term, because the programme there would be from 2020 to 2029, and the programme ends fully in 2048. There's also another US naval programme for these large combat ships, which the Type 26 motor is the preferred option.
Sorry, and the decision to... Sorry, Karen, is that okay? We're right for time. The decision on whether or not to bring forward those engines for the second batch, is that an MOD decision or is that a BAE Systems decision?
No, that's the Ministry of Defence decision. From what I've heard so far, the Ministry of Defence are saying that they don't have the money for it. They're seeking sort of funding from the Treasury.
Right, but there's no way BAE Systems could ride to your rescue.
No, British Aerospace have been supportive and come up with saying, right, and I believe, I'm not privy to the commercial details of it, but in headline terms, British Aerospace and sort of General Electric have went to the government and said, if you bring forward the long lead items on the batch 2 of Type 26, this will mean the programme continuity and it will keep the rugby facility open, and you will then maintain the UK capability. But the Ministry have to find the funding.
Not without influence. So have they backed your campaign to keep it open, or have they taken a neutral posture?
No,
Do you want? No,
No.
fine. I could have talked to your colleagues in the BA and got that, but I mean...
I know that talks have taken place between sort of the very senior management at British Aerospace and our previous managing director, who decided to leave for personal reasons, shall we say.
Okay, I mean, the committee's not going to get drawn into any of that, but what you could see why, particularly with the Canadian and the Australian orders, if I were Charles Woodburn, not that I am, I would want continuity, and I wouldn't want anything that put those orders at risk. So you could see why the company might have a strong incentive to argue to keep you alive.
I mean, we had hoped that perhaps British Aerospace would look to acquire us, because at the moment basically everything is up for sale within General Electric due to its sort of financial position. I think the share values were about $36, are now down to about $16, and everything, it's in the public domain. The chairman, the new chairman, Culp, has said that everything is being considered. They need to raise...
Discussions really gone anywhere, or is that just a theoretical possibility?
There are discussions ongoing with a consortium, to whether that be to a joint venture or sort of complete buy-it, but I'm not privy to the details of that. We hear some information from our colleagues in France, because they have more access to information under French law than we're able to have.
So I don't want to sound obsessed with BAE Systems, but they are of a size that could practically buy you. Yeah? I mean, no small firm is going to buy you, but I mean, maybe a venture capital company might try. But have you had any meaningful discussions with BAE's senior management on this?
We do meet with Charles and the entire senior management team at BAE very regularly. And he absolutely is a decent man. I understand that he's made personal representations to the MOD over this as well. Now, BAE will be incredibly worried about this, because it's not just about Type 26 or the 45 or other programs that BAE are involved in. This is about their relationship with the Canadians and the Australians, where they're setting up a joint venture in, of course, Australia, where these ships will be built in Australia, but they will be utilising power conversion equipment for rugby. That's the purpose of the sale. That was the basis under which this was entered into. If that's no longer the case, and this is now going to be built in France, and not only is it going to be built in France, but it'll be a different motor type, and therefore may need ship redesign, then that's not just delays in the process, but it's also very costly redesign work in the process.
We've got to bring things to a conclusion, so I just want to sum up and make sure we've got this right. So what we're saying is that if this factory closes, there is no way in which these motors for all these future frigates can be produced without significant redesign and extra cost. And therefore there's no way in which what is done in rugby can be just lifted up and transferred even conceptually to non-sea. And but if BAE Systems were to buy the facility, which would have at least the advantage of bringing it back into our sovereign control, they would presumably still be stuck unless the batch 2 work was brought forward, because there'd be nothing for them to do in this specialised respect. So we've got all that. Just one administrative point. We've been seeking to get the Minister to come in, and also seeking to get General Electric to come in. We have a date for both of them, which is the 21st of May. Now, you've said that the 31st of May is a key date.
Yes, that's
as I understand it. That's when the consultation closes. Okay, is there any particular reason for urgency that we should try and insist on GE at least coming in earlier, or are you satisfied that nothing irrevocable is going to happen between the 23rd of April today and the 21st of May, when we're due to have the company and the Minister in separate panels on the same day, that would mean that we need urgently to try and get them in sooner than that?
I think those dates would be adequate to
check that we weren't going to find that we missed some sort of deadline.
I don't think they'll be making decisions prior to the close of the consultation. I would, if we're closing, Chair, just refer you.
Final quick comment from each.
Just to refer you to the pack of materials that we did produce for you. There's a background briefing there, and there's copies of correspondence between myself specifically in relation to Guto Bebb. And Guto Bebb, as the Minister responsible, reconfirmed some of the points that were made by the civil servant who responded to Steve Kerr earlier around this is a business case decision, and therefore the government is constrained in what it can. We don't accept that at all. Our belief is that the D-Poll does allow the government to intervene. In fact, it's paramount that the government does intervene on national security grounds here. It's not just about Type 26, as important as Type 26 is. It's about all that in-service maintenance and retrofit work that goes on, and also future build. There's the power conversion equipment is integral to the Type 31E, which is open for export, of course. For the FSS, if the FSS build is to come to the UK, then it's integral again in terms of the power mechanisms for the FSS. There's the US Navy fleets, and the US won't be doing deals with France, we don't believe, in terms of the supply of engines or anything else. That will go back to the United States, which may be all very nice for GE, because GE has a record of closing its facilities. And in respect to that, I would just refer you to Appendix D, which has a very nice graphic in it, which explains exactly what's happened to the covert team since GE's acquisition of it in 2011, with numerous sites closing, earmarking, of course, rugby in Berlin for closure. So it's a very nice graphic there, but there's also behind that 2 slides, and this is a very large report that was done independently for the European Works Council. It extends to 140 pages, which you'll be pleased to know I've not included in the materials. But I've included 3 pages because the other 2 refer to the argument put forward in the report for the maintenance of the rugby facility. And all of the arguments that we've put forward today were put forward by the independent experts to the European Works Council. And of course those arguments were completely ignored by General Electric at the EWC and have been subsequently ignored throughout the consultation process. So we don't have much belief that GE has interests at heart other than its own. It's often referred to as a finance house as opposed to a manufacturing company. And if you look at where it makes it, over 50% of its profit comes from capital finance as opposed to manufacturing operations, and therefore perhaps it is restructuring itself, but not necessarily in the interests of UK PLC or indeed specifically the work that we do to support our Royal Naval fleets. So all of that is in there. There's a wealth of information in there, that some of which we've outlined to you directly today, some of which we haven't had a chance to, of course, but it's all there for your perusal.
Thank you.
Including some recommendations at the end, where we have got, in the end of our brief, some recommendations for government.
Any last words, Stephen Ross?
So, on behalf of my fellow employees, I'd like to thank the committee for taking the time to take an interest in this, and I would urge the committee to use its best endeavours to hold General Electric and indeed any other company, to stand by the undertakings that they make when they acquire UK companies. I think we all remember what happened with Cadbury's, which was not. And as a layperson, I can only reinforce what Ross and Steve have said, that the Treasury needs to look at the total cost of a project, not just the price. I mean, if rugby closes, we will have UK taxpayers paying the wages of French workers whilst also paying unemployment benefit to the British workforce. And finally, I'd like to say, when you meet with management, the question that we can't understand is, what is the benefit of closing rugby and moving it to Nancy? We can't see any logical reason for that. Please explain it, because they've been unable to do so to us. Perhaps to the committee they may be more forthcoming.
Yeah. Ross, any last words?
Yeah, I mean, you opened up on FSS by thanking us for the work that we've done. So, just to reinforce what Steve said, we would equally thank the committee for the interest that you've taken in not just in FSS, future shipbuilding procurement, because and hopefully there'll be some recommendations comes out of this, and hopefully they'll be taken serious, because we've campaigned long and hard on this here at Westminster, and we've taken it to Scotland, to Northern Ireland, to the regions, and we've won the support of all the main opposition parties. We've just got to convince the government now, and I couldn't let the day go by without. I won't mention the word, but but there's the heightened tension over how we leave or if we leave the EU. I just think there are some real easy wins here for UK PLC in terms of jobs.